In 1839, a Chinese official named Lin Zexu did something that would trigger a war. He confiscated 20,000 chests of opium from British merchants in Canton, or 400 tons of the drug, and he destroyed it, dissolved it in lime and salt water, then flushed it into the sea. The British were furious, not because Lin had destroyed their property, though that was worth millions, but because he'd threatened their solution to an impossible economic problem. Here's the problem. Britain was addicted to Chinese goods. Tea, silk, porcelain. British citizens consumed thousands of tons of Chinese tea every year. The upper classes demanded Chinese silk. Everyone wanted Chinese porcelain, but China didn't want anything from Britain. Nothing. British wool? China made better cloth. British manufactured goods. China made their own. British silver. China would take it, but that meant Britain was hemorrhaging precious metal to pay for Chinese goods. The trade deficit was unsustainable. Britain was literally running out of silver. So Britain found something China would buy, something that would reverse the trade imbalance, something that would make China dependent on Britain instead of the other way around. Opium. Between 1820 and 1840, Britain transformed China from a nation that barely knew opium existed into the world's largest opium market. Millions of Chinese became addicted. The drug destroyed productivity, devastated families, and drained China's silver reserves. The trade deficit reversed. Now China was hemorrhaging silver to buy opium from Britain. When China tried to stop it, Britain went to war. Twice. And won. And forced China to keep buying opium. It's the most successful drug cartel in history, except it wasn't run by criminals. It was run by the British Empire. This is the story of how Britain solved a trade deficit by addicting an entire civilization. How economic warfare became literal warfare. How one of history's great empires was brought to its knees, not by armies, but by a drug, because the Opium Wars weren't about opium. They were about money, and Britain was willing to destroy China to get it. Let's start with why Britain needed China so desperately. By 1800, tea had become essential to British life. Not a luxury, a necessity. Workers drank it for breakfast. The middle class served it all day. The upper classes built entire social rituals around it. Britain was importing £30 million of tea per year from China. £30 million. And it wasn't just tea. British aristocrats demanded Chinese silk for their clothing. British homes needed Chinese porcelain. Chinese goods were status symbols. The problem? China was completely self-sufficient. The Qing Empire in the 1700s, early 1800s was the largest economy on Earth, maybe 30% of global GDP. They produced everything they needed. Advanced agriculture, sophisticated manufacturing. They had no need for foreign goods. When British merchants arrived with wool, clocks, telescopes, manufactured items, Chinese officials were polite but uninterested. We have no need for these things. There was exactly one thing China would accept: silver. So Britain paid for Chinese goods with Spanish silver dollars. Millions of them every year. But Britain didn't have infinite silver. And this trade imbalance was bleeding them dry. By 1800, Britain was running a trade deficit with China of millions of pounds per year. Silver flowing out, tea flowing in, unsustainable. The British East India Company, which controlled British trade with Asia, was in crisis. They needed something China would buy, something that would reverse the trade flow. And they found it growing in India. Opium poppies. The British East India Company controlled Bengal, India's opium-producing region. Indian farmers grew opium under British supervision. The company bought it, processed it, and needed somewhere to sell it. China had a small opium market, maybe 400 tons per year, mostly for medicine, but there was potential for more. So Britain made a business decision: create demand. They couldn't sell opium to China directly. That was illegal under Chinese law. So they used a workaround. British merchants would ship opium from India to the Chinese coast, not to official ports, to smuggling points outside government control. Chinese smugglers would buy the opium and distribute it inland. The British weren't technically violating Chinese law. They were just selling to smugglers who violated Chinese law. It was the perfect crime. Legally deniable, economically brilliant, morally monstrous. And it worked. Between 1800 and 1820, British merchants cultivated the Chinese opium market. They didn't just sell the drug, they marketed it. They created demand. Opium smoking became fashionable in Chinese port cities. Opium dens opened. The drug spread from medicine to recreation to addiction. By 1820, China was importing 4,500 chests of opium per year. By 1830, 19,000 chests. By 1838, 40,000 chests. That's 2,500 tons of opium per year, flooding into China. and the trade deficit reversed. Now China was paying silver for opium. Millions of silver dollars flowing from China to British merchants in India. The British had solved their trade problem by addicting China. Now let's talk about what opium actually did to Chinese society. By 1835, an estimated 10 million Chinese were addicted to opium. In a population of 400 million, that's up to 2.5% of the entire country. But it wasn't distributed evenly. Opium addiction was concentrated in coastal cities, among working-age men. In some regions, 20–30% of adult males were users, and opium addiction isn't casual drug use. It's physically devastating. Addicts needed multiple pipes per day just to function. They'd spend entire days in opium dens, dark, cramped rooms where users lay on wooden boards, smoking pipe after pipe. Productivity collapsed. Men who should be working, farming, crafting, trading, were lying in opium dens. Families fell apart. Wives and children abandoned as men spent all household money on the drug. Chinese officials started reporting economic crisis, agricultural production declining in opium-affected regions, tax revenues falling because workers couldn't pay, social order breaking down, and the silver was flowing out, catastrophically. Remember, China had been receiving silver from global trade for centuries. Chinese merchants sold tea, silk, porcelain, and received silver in return. That silver built China's economy. Now the silver was leaving. To buy opium, between 1820 and 1840, China lost approximately 100 million silver dollars to the opium trade. 100 million. This caused deflation in China. With less silver in circulation, the price of silver rose relative to copper currency. This destroyed ordinary people who used copper coins but had to pay taxes in silver. A farmer's copper coins were worth less and less against the silver he owed in taxes. Tax burdens effectively doubled or tripled. Peasant rebellions started. The Qing government recognized they had a crisis. The drug was destroying social fabric. The silver drain was wrecking the economy. They tried to stop it, repeatedly. In 1729, China banned opium imports. Didn't work, smuggling continued. In 1796, they banned opium dens. Didn't work, they operated underground. In 1813, they banned opium smoking entirely. Didn't work. Addiction doesn't care about laws. The British just kept shipping opium, and Chinese smugglers kept distributing it, and millions kept using it. Because here's the thing about opium, once you're addicted, you'll do anything to get it. Sell your possessions, steal, betray your family. The drug creates its own demand. Britain had created a captive market. Millions of Chinese who couldn't stop buying opium even if they wanted to. It was the perfect economic trap. In 1839, the Chinese emperor appointed Lin Zexu as special commissioner to end the opium trade. Lin was a reformer, incorruptible. He understood what opium was doing to China, and he was willing to take extreme measures. He arrived in Canton, the center of British opium trade, and gave British merchants an ultimatum: surrender all your opium and sign a pledge to never trade it again, or face consequences. The British merchants refused. They claimed they were just businessmen. They weren't responsible for what Chinese smugglers did with the opium. Lin didn't care about legal technicalities. He blockaded the foreign merchants' compound, trapped them inside, and demanded the opium. The British superintendent, Charles Elliot, realized Lin was serious. He convinced the merchants to hand over 20,283 chests of opium, 400 tons. Lin took the opium to the beach, mixed it with lime and salt water in huge trenches, and flushed it into the ocean. It took 23 days to destroy 1,400 tons of opium. Lin personally supervised. He wanted to make sure every ounce was gone. Then he wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, a beautiful, passionate letter asking, "How can Britain sell poison to China when Britain bans the same poison in England? You do not permit opium to injure your own country," he wrote. "But you choose to bring that injury to China. Why?" It was a reasonable question. Britain did ban opium domestically. They knew it was harmful, but they sold it to China anyway. Lin expected a moral response. He got war. Because from Britain's perspective, Lin had destroyed British property worth millions. He'd threatened the trade that solved Britain's deficit with China. He'd disrespected British merchants. And more importantly, he'd challenged Britain's right to trade whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted. So in 1839, Britain sent warships. The first opium. War lasted from 1839 to 1842. It was a mismatch. British steamships and modern artillery versus Chinese wooden junks and outdated cannon. British rifles versus Chinese matchlocks. Industrial military power versus pre-industrial resistance. Britain won decisively. They blockaded Chinese ports, bombarded coastal cities, cut off the Grand Canal. In 1842, China surrendered and signed the Treaty of Nanking. The terms were humiliating. China paid Britain 21 million silver dollars in reparations for the destroyed opium. China ceded Hong Kong to Britain. China opened 5 ports to British trade. And crucially, China legalized opium imports. Britain had gone to war to protect their drug trade and won. But it wasn't over. The Treaty of Nanking didn't actually end the conflict. It just paused it. British merchants wanted more ports, more access, lower tariffs, and they wanted the opium trade explicitly protected. In 1856, they found a pretext for a second war, a minor incident involving a Chinese-owned ship flying a British flag. Britain, now joined by France, invaded again. The Second Opium War lasted from 1856 to 1860. This time, British and French forces marched inland. They reached Beijing. They looted and burned the old Summer Palace, one of China's greatest architectural treasures. They took art, jewels, and historical artifacts worth incalculable amounts. The destruction of the Summer Palace was deliberate terrorism, a message: submit completely, or we'll destroy your cultural heritage. China surrendered again. The Treaty of Tientsin in 1860 was even worse than the first. More ports opened. Foreign diplomats stationed in Beijing. Christians allowed to proselytize. China paid more massive indemnities, and opium was fully legalized and taxed. Britain had won again and secured their drug trade indefinitely. Between 1860 and 1890, opium imports to China continued to grow, peaked at around 6,000 tons per year by the 1880s. The social cost was catastrophic. By 1900, an estimated 15 million Chinese were addicted to opium. That's 3.75% of the population. Entire regions were economically devastated. China's silver reserves were depleted. The Qing government was weakened and eventually collapsed in 1911. The Opium Wars didn't just hurt China economically, they shattered Chinese confidence. For centuries, China had seen itself as the center of civilization, advanced, powerful, self-sufficient. The Opium Wars proved they weren't. Britain, smaller, farther away, had imposed its will on China through superior military, technology, and ruthless economic warfare. It was China's century of humiliation, and opium was the weapon. Britain used to begin it. So what's the lesson? Why does the opium trade matter today? First, trade deficits matter, desperately. Britain faced a trade deficit with China that was bleeding them of silver. That deficit threatened British economic stability, so Britain solved it by any means necessary. The opium trade was economic warfare. Britain weaponized addiction to reverse a trade imbalance. And it worked. By 1850, Britain was receiving more silver from China than they were sending. The deficit was solved, but the moral cost was a civilization suffering. Second, economic power and military power are linked. Britain couldn't have addicted China without the military power to protect the drug trade. When China tried to stop the opium trade, Britain used military force to continue it. The Opium Wars proved that in international relations, military power enforces economic interests. Britain had both. China had neither. Third, this pattern repeats. The Opium Wars aren't ancient history. They're a template for modern economic coercion. The US forcing Japan to open trade in the 1850s, same pattern. The US imposing sanctions on countries that don't comply with American economic interests, same pattern. China building economic dependencies through Belt and Road Initiative, same pattern. But they're the ones imposing it now. Economic coercion backed by the threat of force. That's what the Opium Wars taught the world. Fourth, the victim remembers longer than the perpetrator. In Britain, the Opium Wars are barely taught. They're a footnote, uncomfortable but distant. In China, they're foundational to national identity. Every Chinese student learns about the century of humiliation, beginning with the Opium Wars. When China talks about national rejuvenation, they're talking about recovering from what Britain did to them. When China refuses to be economically dependent on the West, they're remembering opium. China's entire modern foreign policy is shaped by not wanting to repeat 1839-1860. And finally, moral questions don't disappear just because we win. Britain won the Opium Wars, militarily, economically, completely. But history judges them harshly, because they were wars fought to protect a drug trade. Wars fought to keep China addicted. There's no moral defense for that. Britain knew opium was harmful. They banned it domestically, but they sold it to China anyway. For money, the Opium Wars are a case study in how economic interests override moral considerations, how powerful nations will do terrible things to weaker nations if it serves their interests. Britain addicted China, went to war twice to protect that addiction, and won. China paid the price for a century. Millions addicted, silver depleted, confidence shattered, a civilization brought low, all because Britain couldn't accept a trade deficit. The opium trade that bankrupted, China didn't just drain silver, it drained dignity, productivity, and power. And the empire that did it? They called it free trade.